He was supposed to say "I do" in 12 seconds. Ivy Bennett knew that because she had counted every second since the chapel doors opened and the organist drifted into a nervous loop that sounded less like a wedding march and more like a stalled apology. The guests had stopped smiling 3 minutes ago. Her maid of honor had stopped pretending a minute after that. Now the white roses around the altar smelled too sweet, too heavy, like flowers laid on top of something already dead. Ivy stood beneath a wall of stained glass in a silk gown Adrian Vale had chosen himself and felt humiliation arrive in slow, surgical layers. First came confusion, thin and cold. Then disbelief, sharp enough to keep her upright. Then the final cut, the one that hollowed out her chest from the inside. He was not delayed. He was not racing up the church steps with a crooked grin and a breathless excuse. He was gone. When her phone vibrated inside the hidden pocket sewn into her bouquet ribbon, the sound seemed loud enough to split the chapel in half. She looked down at the screen, and for one impossible second she could not breathe. Then she opened the message. "I am sorry. I cannot do this. Leaving is the only way to keep you safe." There was no signature. There did not need to be. No one else in the world could have destroyed her so completely with so few words. Ivy did not faint. She did not scream. She did not create the scene the tabloids would have paid to remember forever. Instead she lowered the bouquet, lifted her chin, and turned to face the 200 guests who had gathered to watch her become a Vale. She saw pity flash through familiar eyes. She saw calculation ignite across Adrian's side of the aisle. She saw her mother begin to tremble in the front pew. The entire room waited for her to collapse. Ivy inhaled once, slow and deliberate, then said in a voice so calm it frightened even her, "Thank you for coming. The wedding will not be taking place." The gasp that moved through the chapel felt alive. Someone whispered her name. A child started crying near the back. Ivy stepped down from the altar without looking at anyone, each movement so controlled it bordered on regal. Outside, summer heat slammed into her bare shoulders. The church bells rang on schedule anyway, bright and cheerful and obscene. Her best friend Nora caught up to her at the fountain, carrying satin shoes in one hand and fury in the other. "Ivy, wait." Ivy stopped only because her knees had turned dangerously unreliable. White petals spun across the water like surrendered flags. "Did he call you?" she asked. Nora's silence answered first. Then her eyes did. "No," Ivy swallowed. "Did you know?" "No," Nora said instantly. "I swear to you, I didn't know. I thought he was with his father. I thought it was some last-minute crisis with the board or the press or one of those impossible Vale family emergencies. Ivy, please look at me." But kindness was unbearable. Kindness would split her open faster than cruelty. She looked instead at the line of black cars, the photographers beyond the iron gate, the skyline glittering in the distance like a threat. Adrian had once told her that New York belonged to people who never hesitated. He had built his entire life around that creed. Yet when the moment came to stand beside her publicly, he had vanished and left 6 shredded sentences in his place. The first tear did not fall until she reached the locked bridal suite upstairs. By then she had ripped the veil from her hair, braced both hands against a polished dressing table, and stared at a reflection that looked like a beautiful stranger arranged by expensive hands. Pearl pins. Bare shoulders. A diamond at her throat from Adrian's grandmother. Lips painted for a vow that had died before it was spoken. When the tear finally slid down her cheek, it felt less like grief than betrayal finding an exit. 2 hours later, the internet did what it always did to elegant disasters. It made them public property. By sundown her face was everywhere. The abandoned bride. The billionaire who vanished. The wedding that died in silk and stained glass. Commentators who had never heard Ivy laugh now discussed her dignity as if it were a stock price. Anonymous strangers blamed Adrian. Others blamed her. Some insisted a woman never gets left at an altar without seeing it coming. Some said she must have ignored signs. Some said women like her always did. By midnight, her pain had become content. 3 days later she learned the second half of the humiliation. Adrian had not only fled the ceremony. He had vanished from Manhattan entirely. His penthouse was empty. His driver had been dismissed. His assistant knew nothing. His father, Victor Vale, issued a statement through the company communications office calling the cancellation a private matter and requesting respect for both families. It was corporate embalming at its finest. It made emotional detonation sound like a calendar change. Ivy refused to remain where every hallway still held his shape. Within a week she sold the apartment he had convinced her to move into before the wedding, boxed the china her mother wanted preserved, returned every unopened gift, and left for the one place no Vale would think to look. Maple Harbor, Maine, was a hard-edged coastal town where winters bit through wool and everyone knew the weather before the forecast did. Her grandmother had once owned a faded inn there called the Ashcroft House, a rambling cedar place with wind-battered shutters, lace curtains, and a wraparound porch that faced a gray Atlantic. It was not strategic. It was not glamorous. It was not New York. It was a place where no one cared about media cycles or board votes. It was a place where a woman could bleed in private. The inn was barely surviving when she arrived. The roof leaked. The books were a mess. Half the guest rooms smelled faintly of mildew and old disappointment. Ivy bought it anyway with what remained of her inheritance and the stubborn fury of a woman who had already lost the future she had been told to want. She learned how to patch plaster. She learned how to negotiate with contractors who thought grief made women soft. She burned her palms on commercial ovens and taught herself to bake her grandmother's orange cardamom cake from a stained recipe card. She turned the old dining room into a candlelit event space. She smiled for guests. She memorized regulars. She worked until exhaustion felt kinder than memory. The years changed her in ways New York never had. She grew sunbrowned in summer and sharp-eyed in winter. She stopped waiting for explanations no one had offered. She built a reputation in town so solid it no longer carried the echo of Adrian Vale's name. By the end of the first year, the whispers about the altar had dulled. By the end of the third, Ashcroft House had become one of the most sought-after wedding venues on the coast, a place where couples came for sea-light vows, polished oak floors, and the kind of care only a woman intimate with ruin could provide. The irony never stopped cutting. Ivy Bennett, who had once been left alone before an altar, now built perfect wedding weekends for strangers and quietly made sure every groom showed up an hour early. 6 years passed that way. Long enough for the city to lose interest. Long enough for the wound to scar without fully closing. Long enough for Adrian to become less a man than a sealed room inside her mind. Then September came in with cold sunlight and the smell of salt and apples. Ivy was in the front garden, kneeling beside a row of hydrangeas, when a black car rolled up the crushed shell driveway. At first she did not recognize it. Nothing that glossy and expensive belonged to Maple Harbor. Then the rear door opened, and the world gave a sickening lurch backward. Adrian stepped out wearing a charcoal coat, a week's worth of sleeplessness in his face, and the kind of controlled grief that looked less performed than lived in. He was broader than he had been at 32, the polished ease gone from his shoulders. His dark hair was threaded lightly at the temples now. The boyish charm that once made roomfuls of investors forgive him for winning had hardened into something more dangerous and more exhausted. He stood beside the car for half a second, looking at the inn as if he had reached the end of something rather than the beginning. Then his gaze found hers. Ivy's body reacted before her mind did. Every muscle went rigid. Her pulse dropped, then slammed back so hard she felt it in her throat. For one furious instant she was 28 again, standing in silk, reading a message that had broken her life in two. Adrian took a step toward her. Ivy. Her name in his mouth still knew exactly where to hurt. She stood slowly, dirt on her palms, cold wind lifting loose strands of hair around her face. There were 20 things she could have said. Most of them involved shutting the gate in his face. Instead she asked the question that mattered. Who died? Adrian stopped. Surprise flickered, then a pained understanding. No one. Then you should leave. She turned back toward the flower bed, because if she looked at him too long she might remember how easily ruin can masquerade as longing. I drove 6 hours from Boston. Drive 6 more. I deserve that. His voice was lower than she remembered, roughened by something more permanent than fatigue. But I need 5 minutes. Ivy laughed once, without humor. Need is an interesting word from a man who sent a text instead of vows. He absorbed the blow without flinching. That was almost worse. Once, Adrian had fought every slight with flawless composure and sharper intellect. Now he stood in her driveway like a man who had arrived prepared to be cut. You can hate me, he said. You should. But please hear me out. I heard you out 6 years ago. She turned then, fully, and the force of her own anger steadied her. I stood in front of everyone I loved while your family looked at me like I was disposable. I spent months waking up in the middle of the night trying to understand how a man can ask a woman to trust him with her whole future and then vanish. So no, Adrian. I do not owe you 5 minutes. I gave you a year of my life. I gave you my reputation. I gave you the kind of belief women aren't stupid enough to give twice. Something moved across his face then, brief and unguarded. Not shame exactly. Something heavier. I know. Do you? She asked softly. Because from where I stood, it looked less like fear and more like choice. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence that followed carried too much history to be empty. Finally he said, Victor found out what I was about to do after the wedding. Ivy's breath caught despite herself. Adrian's father had always felt less like a parent than a boardroom-wearing skin. What were you about to do? Adrian looked at the inn, the porch, the windows glowing gold behind her. Walk away from him. From Vale Global. From every deal he built on bribery, shell companies, and coercion. Ivy stared. He continued before she could answer. I had proof. Enough to destroy him, enough to bring down half his executive circle. I planned to hand it to federal investigators the Monday after the wedding. He found out before the ceremony. He made it very clear that if I went through with it, the first thing he would do was bury your family under every manufactured scandal and debt exposure he could create. Your mother's clinic. Your brother's construction business. Even Nora. He had files on everyone around you. Ivy felt the cold sharpen. Why not tell me? Because I thought leaving would take you out of his line of fire. So you humiliated me to protect me. Yes. He said it like a confession handed over under oath. And I have regretted the shape of that choice every day since. Anger should have come cleanly. Instead it tangled with memory and made her furious all over again. That is not noble, Adrian. That is control-wearing martyrdom. He swallowed. I know that now. No. You know it because time punished you. There is a difference. A gull cried overhead. Somewhere down the road, a truck hit loose gravel. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. Nothing in the world looked rearranged enough for this moment. Adrian stepped closer, but not so close she had to move back. I didn't come here because I think regret earns forgiveness, he said. I came because Victor is buying property in Maple Harbor through 3 cutout firms, and the largest parcel on his list borders your north field. If he gets the zoning vote next month, he'll turn the shoreline into a private freight terminal. Ashcroft House will lose access, the marsh behind your property will be dredged, and the town will be gutted from the water in. Ivy stared at him so hard her eyes burned. How do you know that? Because I've spent the last 3 years dismantling pieces of his network. Because I know how he moves when he wants something. And because the first name I saw in the impact report was yours. The wind shifted. The sea smelled colder. "Why should I believe you?" she asked. Adrian held her gaze, and for the first time she saw it, not in his words but in the terrible steadiness behind them. He had not come to rewrite the past. He had come because danger had found her again, and he had chosen not to stay away this time. "Because," he said quietly, "I already lost you once. I won't stand by and help him do it again." Ivy did not invite him inside. That would have felt too much like surrender. Instead she made him sit on the front porch in the cold while she called the town attorney, her bank manager, and Nora, who arrived 20 minutes later with a legal pad, a wool coat, and a glare sharp enough to strip paint. Adrian took every question they threw at him without defensiveness. He laid out shell companies, land options, traffic studies disguised as infrastructure grants, and the pattern Victor Vale always used before swallowing a coastal town. He had documents on a tablet. He had transfer records. He had maps. Worst of all, he had the kind of specificity that made disbelief feel childish. By evening the porch light had clicked on and Ivy could no longer pretend he had driven into her life with only excuses. He had brought a storm with a filing system. "If this is real," Nora said, flipping through notes, "why not go to the state?" "I have," Adrian answered. "The investigation is moving, but not fast enough for the zoning vote. Victor's counting on that. He always does his cleanest work under deadlines." Ivy folded her arms against the cold. "And what exactly do you expect from me?" "Nothing personal," he said immediately. The answer came too fast, as if he had rehearsed it. "You deserve better than me, assuming I have the right to ask for anything personal. But practically, I need you to fight. Publicly. Early. Hard enough to make secrecy impossible." That, at least, she understood. Fight was a language she had learned here. The next 10 days stripped her calendar to the bone. She met with environmental consultants, town council members, fishermen whose families had worked the harbor for generations, and young business owners who would be crushed if freight traffic ate the tourism economy. Adrian stayed in Maple Harbor under an assumed booking at a small lodge by the marina. She would have preferred he disappear after handing over the evidence, but the situation kept pulling him back into the room. He knew which boards Victor controlled. He knew which council members would fold under pressure. He knew the difference between rumor and leverage. Knowledge, infuriatingly, made him useful. Maple Harbor noticed him almost immediately. It would have been impossible not to. Adrian had once appeared on business magazine covers with the sort of polished confidence people mistook for inevitability. Even now, dressed down in dark sweaters and worn boots, he carried the dangerous stillness of a man long accustomed to commanding outcomes. The town began whispering before the week was over. Some recognized him outright. Some only knew he was expensive, handsome, and connected to Ivy in a way that made her jaw tighten whenever he entered a room. Ashcroft House was booked for a 3-day wedding that weekend, and Ivy refused to let personal catastrophe interfere with work. She moved through table settings, floral deliveries, tasting notes, and seating charts with iron composure while Adrian helped unload rented heaters in the rain because one of the delivery men had failed to show. He did it without fanfare, without trying to leverage goodwill out of labor. The bride's mother thanked him twice before realizing who he was. By midnight the whole kitchen staff knew. "That's him," whispered Rosa, the pastry chef, while icing a cake under brutal fluorescent lights. "The one from the articles?" "Yes," Ivy said flatly. Rosa glanced through the service window where Adrian was carrying chairs with 2 local teenagers. "Well," she said after a beat, "he certainly looks miserable enough." Ivy hated that the comment almost made her smile. Late Saturday night, after the final sparkler exit and a successful cleanup, Ivy found Adrian alone on the back lawn staring at the dark ribbon of ocean beyond the bluff. The wind had picked up, whipping his coat against his legs. She should have walked past him. Instead she stopped 10 feet away and said, "You're in the way of my insomnia." A corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. More like the memory of one. I used to be in the way of most things. Still are. Fair. She crossed her arms. Why didn't you marry someone else? He looked at her then, and whatever answer she had expected died unspoken. Because leaving you ruined me for substitutions. The words landed too hard. Ivy's pulse stumbled. Don't do that, she said quietly. Do what? Speak like grief makes you honest. It doesn't. It just makes you fluent. He absorbed that too. The moonlight edged his face in silver, making him look both older and more familiar. I've thought about that day every day, he said. Not in the dramatic way people confess things in movies. In the practical, ugly way. The exact temperature of the chapel hallway. The sound of my driver shutting the car door. The second I realized I was choosing the kind of pain I could survive over the kind I couldn't bear watching happen to you. I was wrong. I know that. But I was not careless with you. I was terrified. Ivy looked away first. Not because she was convinced, but because something in his voice had reached the place she had spent 6 years sealing shut. She hated that. She hated him for knowing where to hurt, and perhaps worse, where to heal. The ocean thundered below them. Somewhere inside the inn a staff member laughed, distant and bright. When Ivy finally spoke, her voice was steady again. Help me stop your father, she said. After that, we will discuss what, if anything, you are owed. Adrian bowed his head once, as if she had handed down a sentence he intended to honor. Understood. Victor Vale arrived in Maple Harbor without warning and exactly on time for maximum damage. It was a Tuesday, gray and windless, when 3 black SUVs rolled onto Main Street and parked in front of the town hall as if the whole square had been reserved for his appetite. Ivy saw him through the cafe window across the street while meeting with a marine biologist and nearly dropped her coffee. Victor had aged into elegance the way some weapons are refinished instead of retired. His silver hair was immaculate. His coat looked understated enough to be lethal. He crossed the sidewalk flanked by lawyers and local consultants wearing the serene expression of a man who considered resistance a temporary inconvenience. He knows, Adrian said from beside her. They had been reviewing maps at the corner table. He was on his feet before she could answer, every line of his body tightening. He wouldn't come himself unless he knew we were ahead of schedule. Then let him know I'm not afraid of him. Adrian's gaze cut to hers. Being afraid of him is not weakness, Ivy. It's accurate. Maybe in your world, she said, rising. In mine, we don't hand predators the town because they have better wool coats. The first public meeting that night overflowed. Fishermen in work jackets stood shoulder to shoulder with inn owners, retirees, teachers, teenagers, and 3 reporters from Portland who had caught the scent of a development war involving a disgraced dynasty. Victor sat in the front row with polished patience, as if he were attending a recital instead of a land grab. Adrian remained along the side wall, not hidden exactly, but controlled. He understood that his presence complicated things. To half the room he was the prodigal son of a corporate empire. To the other half he was the man who had once destroyed Ivy Bennett in front of a chapel full of witnesses. Ivy spoke anyway. She spoke with maps behind her and tide charts in hand. She spoke about marsh erosion, fishing routes, drainage collapse, tourism revenue, truck noise, property devaluation, and the practical violence done by men who arrive promising investment while quietly pricing locals out of their own futures. She did not once mention Adrian. She did not once mention 6 years ago. She did not need to. By the time she sat down, the room had shifted toward her so decisively that even the reporters had stopped pretending neutrality. Victor waited until the applause faded. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and smiled with the polished benevolence of a man funding a hospital wing. Ms. Bennett's passion for this town is admirable, he said. But emotion should not be mistaken for economic literacy. Maple Harbor is dying the slow death of nostalgia. Our project would create jobs, infrastructure, and national relevance. Progress often looks frightening to those invested in sentimentality. Murmurs moved through the hall. Ivy started to rise again, but Victor was not finished. As for motives, he continued lightly, I understand my son has taken a sudden interest in local affairs. Adrian has always had a weakness for rescuing women from circumstances he helped create. The room tightened. Ivy felt the blow land before the whispering started. Victor turned his calm, blade-thin gaze toward her. Tell me, Ms. Bennett. Did he come here as a civic advocate, or because he believes one more grand gesture might undo what he did to you in New York? Adrian moved before anyone else. That's enough. The words cracked through the room with such force the microphone squealed. Victor looked almost pleased. There he is. Adrian stepped into the aisle, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, stripped of every ounce of practiced corporate diplomacy. You do not get to use her as theater. Victor's smile cooled. I learned theater from you. The silence that followed was electric. Everyone in the room understood that this had become bigger than zoning. Ivy stood too, but this time not from injury. From clarity. Victor wanted distraction. He wanted scandal and spectacle because spectacle diluted evidence. No, she said into the microphone, her voice clean and carrying. You do not get to rewrite me into collateral damage for your family drama. Every head turned. Victor's expression changed by a fraction. It was enough. Yes, Ivy continued, your son left me at the altar. Everyone here now knows that. But I am not standing against this project because a man broke my heart. I am standing against it because your company intends to break this town for profit and call it modernization. If you want to discuss my personal history, you can do it after you explain the dredging report your firm buried in Appendix D. She held up the document. Gasps rippled. One of the reporters swore softly under his breath. Victor's lawyers leaned toward each other like men realizing the floor plan had changed. Adrian looked at Ivy as if he had forgotten how to breathe. She did not return the look. Not then. Her victory was not his absolution. But when the meeting ended in chaos and cameras followed Victor into the square, he passed close enough to murmur, he still watches you the way men watch the only door out of a burning room. Ivy kept her gaze ahead. And you still mistake observation for possession. Outside, rain began without warning, cold and immediate. Victor paused at the top of the town hall steps and delivered one final look toward Adrian, one part threat and one part invitation to war. Adrian did not blink. Later that night, when the reporters were gone and the square had emptied, Ivy found a sealed envelope wedged beneath the windshield wiper of her truck. Inside was a single photograph of her brother leaving his construction office that afternoon. On the back, in Victor's precise handwriting, were 6 words. History has a talent for repetition. Fear did not look the way Ivy had once imagined it would. It did not arrive screaming. It arrived clean, cold, and deliberate, like a hand closing around the back of her neck. She called her brother before Adrian could ask. Ben answered on the second ring, annoyed because he was on a ladder and convinced she was overreacting until she sent him the photograph. Then his voice changed. 10 minutes later he had locked down his office, called his insurance carrier, and agreed to let one of Adrian's private security contacts do a sweep of his properties before dawn. Ivy hated that it had come to this. She hated even more that Adrian had anticipated it. Victor is escalating because he's losing control of the timeline, Adrian said in the dim kitchen of Ashcroft House while storm rain battered the windows. Threats are what he uses when secrecy stops working. He threatened my family once already, Ivy said. Apparently he missed the feeling. Adrian stood across the butcher block island with both hands braced on the wood, as if physically restraining himself from reaching toward her. I should have told you the first time. Yes. I know. And you still decided for me. He bowed his head once. Yes. There were nights when anger made him easier to face than remorse. Remorse invited softness, and softness around him felt like standing on black ice. The following week turned Maple Harbor into a battlefield disguised as civic life. Flyers appeared overnight accusing Ivy of fronting a personal vendetta. A rumor spread that Ashcroft House was nearly bankrupt and she was fighting the development only to inflate a future sale price. Two fishermen who had spoken publicly against the project found surprise tax audits waiting in their mailboxes. Adrian worked 16-hour days assembling counterpressure. He sent evidence to journalists, arranged legal briefings, and met with a federal investigator in Portland under conditions he refused to disclose. He moved like a man who had spent his life learning how power concealed itself and had finally decided to hunt it in its own language. But there were cracks now, and Ivy saw them when no one else did. He drank too much coffee. He rarely slept. Once, after a meeting at the marina, she found him in his rental car with both hands gripping the steering wheel and his eyes closed so tightly the tendons in his neck stood out. "Are you having a heart attack?" she asked through the open window. One eye opened. "Not today." That wasn't reassuring. He huffed something almost like laughter and sat back. Victor likes cornering people into reenacting their worst decisions. I'm trying very hard not to give him a sequel. Ivy should have walked away. Instead she leaned against the car door. "Did you ever love me enough to trust me?" The question landed between them with no room for strategy. Adrian looked at her for a long time before answering. "I loved you enough to fear losing you more than I feared becoming the worst version of myself." "That isn't what I asked." "No," he said quietly. "I didn't trust you enough. Not because you were weak. Because I thought love gave me the right to choose the damage." Ivy looked out at the harbor, at ropes slapping masts, at gulls tilting white against iron clouds. Honesty should have soothed her. Instead it hurt in a cleaner place. "That," she said after a moment, "is the first true thing you've given me that doesn't ask for sympathy." He nodded once, accepting the verdict. 2 nights later they were forced into proximity by logistics and weather. A nor'easter rolled down the coast, knocking out power to half the town and flooding the road to the lodge where Adrian had been staying. Ashcroft House filled with stranded wedding guests from a cancelled event in Camden, 3 elderly tourists, and Adrian, who arrived soaked through after helping Rosa and her husband move bakery equipment above the floodline. Ivy gave him the last dry room on the 3rd floor because she was not cruel enough to send him back into the storm and not foolish enough to pretend the decision was simple. At midnight she found him in the darkened library feeding logs into the fireplace with his shirt sleeves rolled up. Candlelight carved shadows along his face. Rain hammered the windows so hard it sounded like pebbles. "You always hated storms," he said without turning. "I hated being trapped in them." She crossed to the sideboard and poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass for herself. Some distinctions matter. When he finally looked at her, exhaustion had stripped the polish off him entirely. "I dreamed about this place before I ever saw it," he admitted. "The kind of life you might have built if I had been brave enough to deserve it." Ivy took a slow sip. "Do not romanticize my survival, Adrian. I built this because you broke something and left me alone with the pieces." "I know." "No. You know the sentence. I'm not sure you know the cost." The room went quiet except for wind and fire. Adrian stepped closer, careful, like a man approaching an animal he had once injured. "Then tell me the cost." She should not have. She knew that. But the storm, the darkness, and the years between them blurred something she had held rigid for too long. So she told him about the months she could not enter a church without shaking. The panic attacks in grocery store checkout lines because every public wait felt like abandonment. The articles she stopped reading and still somehow memorized. The way she had watched every groom at every wedding she hosted and secretly measured the distance from altar to exit. Adrian did not interrupt once. By the time she finished, her throat hurt. His eyes looked wrecked. "I'm sorry," seemed too small to survive the room. So he did not say it. Instead he said, "If I could cut that day out of you, I would take it into myself and keep it there." Ivy's laugh was soft and tired and close to breaking. That is exactly the kind of sentence a dangerous man says right before a woman forgets what she learned. He did not deny it. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. Inside, the fire dropped and shifted, sending up a burst of sparks that lit his face with a kind of brutal tenderness. For one reckless second she wondered what it would feel like to be held by a man who had finally learned the price of losing her. The thought was so unsafe she set down her glass and walked out before it could become a memory. The scandal detonated on a Thursday morning at 8:12, just as Ivy was arranging white anemones for a rehearsal dinner. Her phone began vibrating non-stop on the prep table. Nora looked up from the seating chart with a frown. Either someone died or you're trending again. It was worse. Someone had leaked a private settlement file from 6 years earlier, one proving that Victor had paid 3 media outlets to suppress specific financial angles tied to the cancelled wedding while amplifying others that painted Ivy as unstable, demanding, and socially ambitious. The documents were real. So were the attached emails, which included messages from Vale executives discussing narrative placement, containment of the bride, and preservation of investor confidence. By 9 o'clock every national outlet that had once mocked her was running some version of the same story. The runaway wedding had not been private fallout. It had been engineered fallout. Ivy stood frozen in the kitchen while reporters began calling again, as if 6 years of silence had merely been a commercial break. She should have felt vindicated. Instead she felt flayed. Public correction did not erase public humiliation. It simply reopened it under better lighting. Adrian arrived from Portland just after 10 with rain on his coat and fury so tightly controlled it looked almost calm. "I didn't leak it," he said the second he found her in the pantry. "I know. Victor did. That caught her. Why would he expose himself?" Adrian's jaw flexed. "Because the leak is incomplete. He wants the country focused on what he did to you then instead of what he's doing to Maple Harbor now. Outrage is easier to survive than scrutiny. He's trading moral disgust for strategic fog." Nora appeared in the doorway holding 2 phones and a profanity she did not finish. "Too late. 3 cable shows want comments by noon. Also there's a van from New York parked outside and Rosa threatened to stab someone with a piping tip." Ivy closed her eyes for one hard second. "Get everyone off the property who doesn't belong here. If any guest asks questions, tell them we are prioritizing privacy and service as usual." "Ivy," Nora said gently, "you do not have to play hostess through this." "Yes, I do." She opened her eyes and found Adrian watching her with the expression of a man witnessing damage recur in real time. That's the difference between being broken in public and surviving in public. The coffee still has to be poured. By afternoon the inn was under siege. Reporters lined the driveway. Drones hovered illegally over the bluff until Ben knocked one out of the sky with a fishing net to general applause from the kitchen staff. Ivy moved through the chaos with terrible grace, answering nothing, surrendering nothing. But by dusk the pressure had found its mark. A luxury wedding client called to postpone until media conditions improve. A corporate retreat cancelled for the spring. 2 longtime vendors asked, with painful politeness, whether the property expected ongoing controversy. Maple Harbor supported her, yet business still measured risk more than loyalty. Victor knew exactly where to strike. That evening the town council announced an emergency special session to revisit the harbor vote in light of new investment assurances from Vale Development. Adrian swore softly when he heard. "He's trying to force it through while everyone's distracted." "Then we stop him publicly," Ivy said. "Again. He wants you exhausted. He should have chosen a worse woman." The special session was scheduled for Saturday night in the old cannery warehouse by the docks because the regular hall could not hold the crowd. Rain swept across the harbor in cold silver sheets as half the town packed the building. Cameras were everywhere. Victor sat at the front beside his attorneys with an expression of practiced sympathy, as if the reopened scandal had grieved him personally. Adrian stood near the back until the hearing began, speaking in low tones to a federal contact Ivy did not recognize. The council chair opened with procedural language. Victor's lead attorney moved for expedited approval. Then Ivy was called to speak. She walked to the microphone while the room lifted phones like a field of small lit weapons. 6 years earlier, public attention had made her feel skinned alive. Tonight it made her feel sharpened. "I am not here to relive a wedding," she began. "I am here because a corporation that once treated my life as a disposable media problem is trying to treat this town the same way." The room quieted. She held up the leaked emails. "These documents matter, but not because they prove I was wronged. They matter because they show method. Suppress facts. Manufacture narrative. Isolate the target. Frame resistance as emotional instability. Sell harm as inevitability. This is not history. This is a business model." Applause broke, quick and fierce. Victor's expression did not change. Ivy continued, voice gaining force with every sentence. She spoke about trust, shorelines, labor, memory, and the violence of men who called extraction progress. She was halfway through when the rear doors opened and 3 federal agents stepped inside. The room did not fully understand what it was seeing until Adrian moved away from the wall and said, clear enough for every microphone to catch, "I'd like the council to note that Vale Development's environmental submission omitted criminally material data already under active federal review." Chaos erupted. Victor rose so fast his chair toppled backward. For the first time since Ivy had known him, control slipped visibly from his face. He turned toward Adrian with naked hatred. "You ungrateful little fool." Adrian did not flinch. "No," he said. "Just late." The warehouse became noise and motion at once. Council members shouting for order. Reporters pushing forward. Town residents standing on folding chairs to see over shoulders. Victor's attorneys trying to interpose themselves between their client and the agents now crossing the floor with clipped, inevitable purpose. Ivy stood at the microphone with her heart pounding so hard the edges of her vision pulsed. This was the moment she had wanted for weeks, the collapse of his certainty, the public fracture of the machine that had treated her pain like a negotiable expense. And yet what she felt first was not triumph. It was recognition. This was what men like Victor feared most, not prison, not shame, but losing control of the story. Victor Vale, one of the agents said, voice carrying above the uproar, "We have a warrant to seize records related to fraudulent land acquisition, bribery, market manipulation, and environmental falsification." The crowd inhaled as one body. Victor went still in that terrifyingly elegant way he had when calculating whether fury or charm would serve him better. He chose fury. "This is retaliation," he snapped, glaring at Adrian. "You think this woman made you brave? She made you weak." Adrian stepped forward through the storm of cameras until he stood where the whole room could see him. There was no polish left in him now. No dynasty, no performance, no strategic distance. Only a man who had finally decided what mattered and was willing to lose everything for it. "No," he said, each word distinct as steel hitting stone. "She made me ashamed of confusing control with love. There's a difference." Victor laughed, harsh and disbelieving. "You threw away an empire for her." Adrian's gaze shifted once, to Ivy, and whatever answer the room expected changed shape in the silence between them. "No," he said quietly. "I threw away the empire because it was built like a crime scene. I'm standing here because she deserved the truth long before I found the courage to tell it." Ivy felt the words land somewhere deeper than wound, deeper even than forgiveness. Truth. Not romance. Not a plea. Truth offered at last without strategy wrapped around it. Victor looked from Adrian to Ivy and seemed to understand, too late, that the terms had changed. He had always believed relationships were leverage and pain was currency. What stood before him now was something he had never managed to own. Choice. The agents reached him then. Cameras flashed hard enough to bleach the room white. Reporters shouted questions. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor. Victor pulled one arm free long enough to level a final stare at Ivy, cold with the promise of old habits. You think this ends because a few men with badges arrived? There will always be another room where decisions get made. Ivy stepped away from the microphone and met his gaze head-on. Maybe. But you won't be in it. The line moved through the warehouse like a lit fuse. Applause hit next, sudden and deafening. Victor was escorted out through a corridor of phones, agents, and townspeople who no longer bothered hiding their contempt. The instant he disappeared into the storm, the tension in the room broke into wild overlapping sound. Council members adjourned in panic. Reporters swarmed Adrian. Town residents surged toward Ivy with hands on her shoulders, gratitude in their voices, fury still burning in their faces. She barely heard them. Across the chaos Adrian had gone very still. Too still. He answered one question from a reporter, turned as if to move toward her, and then the color drained from his face so fast her body reacted before thought did. Adrian. He caught the edge of a table, missed, and hit the concrete hard enough to silence half the room. The next minutes blurred. Ben calling for space. Nora kneeling beside Ivy. One of the agents shouting for the EMT team stationed outside because of the crowd size. Adrian had been running on almost no sleep, too much caffeine, and a stress load that would have broken cleaner men. The doctor later called it exhaustion and an arrhythmia triggered by weeks of sustained pressure. At the time, all Ivy knew was the sight of him on a stretcher under warehouse lights, pale and stubbornly conscious, trying to say something while the paramedics worked. She followed the ambulance to the hospital through rain so heavy the wipers were almost useless. In the emergency bay, they made her wait beneath fluorescent lights that turned everyone into a version of themselves stripped of myth. Nora brought coffee. Ben brought silence. Midnight became 1 a.m, then 2. Finally a physician with tired eyes told her Adrian was stable, monitored, furious about being admitted, and asking for exactly one person. Ivy should have left. The old logic was simple. A woman learns or she repeats. But that night had burned away something brittle inside her, and what remained was not innocence. It was discernment. Adrian was awake when she entered, one arm attached to monitors, shirt collar open, all his defenses gone. He looked at her the way people look at shore after too much water. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "For tonight?" she asked. "For 6 years." She moved closer until she stood beside the bed. "Then stop apologizing like it's a substitute for change." His mouth softened at that, pained and almost grateful. "I love you," he said, no performance left in it. "I loved you badly. Then I loved you from a distance. If there is any future in which you can look at me without reliving that chapel, I will spend the rest of my life deserving it. If there isn't, I will still be grateful I finally told you the truth before it was too late." Ivy looked at him for a long moment, feeling the old wound, the new clarity, and the terrible tenderness of a man who had finally learned not to ask love to excuse cowardice. When she answered, her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "Then heal," she said. "And we'll see what survives."